Well, I'm Dick Kilburg. I currently have my own consulting and coaching business focusing on the development of senior leaders, largely in higher education and academic medicine, but also have a number of clients in client organizations in other industries in the United States.
Okay. And I know that you have a large body of work, but I also understand you have a recent book.
Yeah, the last one I published was in 2012. It's called Virtuous Leaders. All of my books were published by the American Psychological Association.
The topic of your presentation here yesterday or today is executive presence.
Yeah, it's managing presence in executive coaching engagements.
Can you talk to me a little bit about what that means?
Well, as I said in the introduction to the workshop yesterday afternoon, when you do the kind of work developing leaders and we get pulled into organizations, it's actually pretty rare that we get pulled in by the leader, him or herself. The first telephone call is usually somebody associated with the organization or a colleague who's making a referral. And it's not infrequent that we have a part of the conversation that goes something like this, that the individual that's being referred doesn't show up in the room properly, that they create experiences with other people that are less than optimal, they don't have the proper presence. When they're in a group, they don't seem to be able to influence them, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this terminology about presence that floats in our work with these organizations and these individuals. And I've done a fair amount of that with clients from time to time, and you get more of a sense of it if you give a more extensive engagement and you actually get to shadow people and see them through aspects of their daily lives as a leader. It's pretty rare that we actually get the opportunity to do that, but when you do, and you see them with their teams, or you see them in one-on-ones, or you see them in other settings, you have a much more intuitive sense about who they are and how they show up. So the way I introduced it is as presence is pretty much like pornography, you know it when you see it. And when I went to the literature, scientific literature, to see what had been done, there's very, very little in the scientific literature that studies this, or there aren't even formal modalities or methodologies that have been developed to look at it.
Yeah, I think it's even hard to find a definition at this point.
Well, it's interesting because then when I did, I got through that piece of it, and that was actually a relatively quick piece of research. Then I went to Amazon to see if there are any books on it, and it actually turns out in the last 10 years that there have been 4 pretty decent books, largely cooked by consultants selling present services. But some people that have done a fair amount of thinking about it. One of the books, consulting company actually did a piece of survey research to their client organizations, trying to make a determination about what other people saw as present. So I didn't have to make everything up myself with regard to it, but it forced me to do an awful lot of thinking about these kinds of issues and what other concepts and what other kinds of issues that were embedded in it. So it led me on my own paths, as these things typically do. It led me on my own explorations, my own discoveries.
Cool. And some of the key things that you discovered?
Well, I've been a student of nonverbal communication. Anybody who does the work either has some formal training or at least a lot of formal and informal exposure to those issues. And in fact, there was a guy that in my training years who was at Western Psychiatric Institute and Clinic at the University of Pittsburgh, who last name was Conlon, and he was one of the pioneers of doing film analysis in the study of nonverbal communication. So I was in any number of classes with him as a second and third year graduate student in clinical psychology, where he would show pieces of film of people doing this kind of thing, or a psychiatric interview, or people attending a meeting, and they were about literally trying to create the equivalent of the grammar and the syntax of nonverbal communication to see if they could unlock what is it that people were doing with regard to this. Were we speaking a separate and identifiable language? So it sent me back to that in terms of there are verbal and nonverbal aspects of presence, and I knew Paul Eckert's work and a number of other things, so that was one streak of this, which was to go back 40 years into my own professional history and say, okay, what's happened since then? So I pulled that in, and then that led me as well to another piece of my explorations, which was, I did a degree in professional writing back in the 1980s, so storytelling and narrative has been a very important thing to me all my life, and I think about those issues in the terms that I work. And then that led me to back to theater, and so I read the two books that are available that I could find on Stanislavski method in terms of preparing actors and preparing a production in a theater, and that's all about the preparation of presence and then the delivery of performance in presence. And then the third stream of the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years or so is deepening my knowledge about the development of expertise. And lots of science going back now 60-some years, really since the beginning of experimental psychology in 1879 in Wundt's lab. It's been a centerpiece on human learning, and human learning is fundamentally about how humans develop the ability to do something, how quick they do it, et cetera, only that brand of research has gotten much deeper and much clearer about how we go ahead and do it. So it's the combination of those things that then became the content of the workshop.
Do you find, I certainly do, that on first introduction to a leader, that often there is little to no ability to understand their own impact or to describe their own impact, the things that we would call presence, and that we really have to kind of back up and teach them what it is that's being perceived?
I would say it varies widely. I think that I've coached a number of people that were extraordinarily intuitive about the way in which they could command it, they could change it, they could deliberately use it. At the same time, I've had a lot of coaching engagements with people that you're intimating are basically clueless about how other people perceive or experience them. And they are more or less disconnected between what their intents are to impact other people and the way they actually do it. That there is not a lot of conscious mentation that goes on about, I'm trying to influence this person, so what is the best way of doing it? Well, they end up doing it more or less ritually, the things that they learn to do, almost always originally in families of origin, turns out to be the foundations of all of their approaches to relationships, to relating, and therefore to leading in organizational settings. So you very often end up unpacking pieces of that, significant pieces of that in the work that you're doing with leaders. The people who are what I think of as performance artists in these domains, some of them I've seen, they're just really, really extraordinary. And the work that you do with them is less about, let's do some archaeology here, let's do some exhumation of who you became and what you're trying to do, and it becomes much more refinements in practice. I've got literally this performance to do, so what am I trying to do? And who's the target of influence and of this panoply of tools that I know that I have and that I can deploy, what's the best approach to doing that? And those are probably the highest level of engagements that you get, pretty much, because those are people who are...
Well, the people who have generally, I think, worked a lot on issues related to this to get to that point.
Yeah,
or occasionally you have somebody who's intuitive about it.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that there's a... I'll use the word, it's not quite that, but there's almost a stereotype of the clueless leader, of the leader who has no self-awareness. And I think that stereotype is held by a lot of people in the helping industries, and they project onto people in leadership positions a lot of the experiences that they have in the helping work that they're accustomed to doing with people who come in and acknowledge a lot of putting themselves in that client role or that counselee role or the patient role, or, that they are clueless in certain aspects of their lives. And because that work tends not to elicit the whole human being, but the traumatized pieces of them, you really don't get to see how competent they are. You put them in a role and they stay in role, and your job in some respects is to keep them in that role.
Well, oftentimes I think it serves the purposes of the organization that they're in, and there isn't a lot of payoff to come out of it.
Well, I was thinking about this. I was thinking about this actually coming out of one of the presentation that we just came out of this morning, and what's the true purpose of organizational life in the modern world and of governance in the modern world? And I think your comment goes right to it. Is the average organization, either for-profit or not-for-profit, in the world today really designed to liberate humanity? And I think we could all probably say that on average organizations are not designed to liberate the people who belong to them.
That's where I was going. You said it much better than I could. Related to that, something occurs to me, which is that I think that even focusing on learning about presence and expanding your view is very much an intentional process for most people, and it's kind of there's kind of a long lead up to get to that strong enough intention to open the frame or to open themselves, would seem to me.
Yeah, I think that that's the case. I think most of us, at least living in the Western world, in the rich part of the world, do certain pieces of this more or less intuitively. You have to choose the clothes that you wear. You choose if you wear glasses, you choose the glasses that you wear. You choose your shoes. And we are bombarded with images in the consuming world, which has now become the entire world, about what's true and proper about the way you are supposed to dress up here. And there are a lot of television shows now, competitive television shows, that are all about this. And there is a whole universe of critics that extend out there that basically that they just whine and point fingers and conduct public humiliation rituals that are addressed to the surface manifestations of it. At the same time, you have the blogosphere and you have all these other kinds of things, so that if you are a public figure, if you are a leader, for example, you never escape. I mean, and it's almost 24 hours, 365, that you are you're bathed in constant criticism about what your presence is and about what your performance is, so you don't go without feedback. But I think your comment is that aside from those particular individuals, I mean, you see it largely in political debates, and then you really get a sense of how they've been coached to presence, to perform. I think your comment is that the average person doesn't get up in the morning, and that this was one of my messages about what our work should be with people, is that it should be a more conscious practice, that we should be conscious that when we are with a client or in an organization and we're in the role of coach, we're in the role of consultant, we're in the role of leaders, to use the theater or to use what you can think of as acting performance. You are enacting a role. And there are roles. There are roles in the room, and you're not the only role. And there is usually a script, even if it's not scripted. There's not a formal text, but there's always an informal text. There's a covert and overt world that you play in. So there's a specific agenda that may be written down, but there are always hidden agendas in the room that play out. And so there is a narrative. And so the metaphor of theater and plays, it actually plays out, but There are arts of what you can think of as preparing the play, preparing actually to deliver a performance, and then every time you sit down, it's improv. It's basically an improvisational performance in either a dualistic world, or if you're coaching a team or a group or even a larger group of people, you're making it up.
Yeah, the next level of that, though, is if I think of what I gained from virtuous leadership, which I rely on a lot, and I'm not a big flatterer, but big, important piece, and if I put that together with what I've learned at this conference about theater, there needs to be an underlying truth, and there needs to be an underlying honesty. And yes, you craft an image, but it has to be standing on a solid base. And when it's not, most of us can see through it.
Well, here's what I would say to that. I think that there's a longing for that. That you hear, okay,
that would be true
there's,
for me.
There's authentic leadership. We want the true self to come out. I don't think that's so much true.
You don't?
No, I don't think in the world of leadership, in the formalities. I think it is certainly true in our personal relationships at some level, but I'm not sure how well prepared we are as human beings to dwell in a relationship where the true nature of the person that we're relating to is on permanent view 24/7.
No, I would definitely agree with that.
And so I think that where it transfers to is that you don't want a leader who you experience basically as constantly putting on a show, and it's only about a show, that person is disconnected from any semblance of who he or she is. But by the same token, and here again in the work that I've done, and I've done this workshop, this is the second time, it's a more abbreviated version. We do have, depending on which personality theory or which psychological theory you look at, we have different dimensionalities of who we are. Again, another thing I was talking about yesterday is that when we tend to think of diversity, we tend to think traditionally of the large issues that we can see, the more visible domains of diversity, race, gender, and we can get at certain other kinds of things, age, we can hear about education. Those are things that are easy to unpack because they tend to be stereotyped and shorthanded. Okay, you're a woman, I'm a man. You're this tall, I'm this tall. You went to school here, this is your educational background. So we can hook onto those things very, very quickly. And there's certain elements of truth to that. But what you're going after is what's behind that. I want to really see who, because that's all part of the kabuki. I want to see, all right, what's your journey? And the presentation this morning, I want to evoke some, quote, truth. I want to know what your traumas are. Well, in my experience, there aren't many people who are walking around the world saying, let's sit down and talk about your traumatic history. And there are not many people who are sitting down, and as she said, in the example that she just gave, there aren't many people who want to wander around and talk about their traumatic histories, because that's the place where you are most personally vulnerable, and for the most part, people have quasi-healed or not from those kinds of experiences. And the average person is completely unprepared to know how to deal with it.
I have to agree with all of that, and you're making some distinctions that I think are correct. I agree with it. Maybe what I'm looking for more is a demonstrated attempt to continue to explore oneself. And to me, a leader who is increasingly self-reflective or has some kind of awareness that it is going to be layers and layers and there's no end point. I don't really mean trying to get people to expose their trauma. That's not where I'm going, but not the artificial masks that are, this thick.
Yeah, and it's there's a gradient. I think that's what we're both trying to say. That what I think we all want to experience, and this goes back to the 1950s in the psychotherapeutic literature, and Carl Rogers and that whole group of people, they basically came to one of the fundamentals of relating to people in a helping relationships is genuineness. That somebody's not going to make progress in a relationship where they experience the party that they're trying to get help from is ingenuine. I think that the same thing is true with leaders, that if you're on somebody's team and you don't experience them, at least episodically, as genuine, and when those episodes of genuineness are expressed, and this is the work that I often do with people, is the notion of strategic selection. That really, really refined leaders are acutely aware that they're performing in everything that they do. And what they are doing in a lot of my coaching is, what are you strategically choosing out of all of those things that you know about yourself, out of all those things that you know about the world and the world in which you live, your organization, your industry, et cetera, et cetera. What are you strategically choosing at that moment to use to create performance?
Exactly.
And to move as a function, if you're the CEO of an organization, you're responsible for helping everybody else in the organization move the organization in the world to be achieving what it's designed to do, what it says it wants to do in the world. And so the argument or the advocacy that we should be telling the truth all of the time with regard to that belies the complexity in organizational performance.
I think, and I completely agree, and I think the word genuine is really what, you gave me what I was reaching for. There has to be something real in it. It has to be, you just said it really well, it has to be choosing from within the strengths and capacities that have been developed in the individual, and making the discernment of where you use different skills that are coming from inside.
Yeah,
something like that.
So there's some really good examples. You know, if you're a company, and let's just say you happen to be a fracking company, you're a natural gas company, and you're the drilling company. Somebody knocks on your door and says, you want to lease your property. We expect you to stay on it. We're going to lease the mineral rights to it. This is what you'll get. And then we're going to drill a number of holes, and we're going to put permanent pumping stations on, and this gas is going to flow up. And then they give you a legal document, page after page after page, about what the risks are. They hand you a check first, and they say, okay, sign. And they don't walk through that, okay, there may be methane in your water, and they don't walk through that there may be carcinogens that they pump into the water that they use to pump down into the earth to literally fracture the rock to release the gas, and that there could be long-term environmental damage. None of that is discussed. And then when you see the advocates, if you will, the spokespersons for the industry, and they sit there and they say there's no research evidence to suggest that there are long-term costs, or there are long-term injuries, or we're really going to hurt people, or we're causing skin rashes or brain damage or any of that other kind of stuff. When they sit there in front of a television audience and or at a political hearing and saying that, we know, I mean, we have an intuition that their presence is false. That what they are doing is painting a picture that is phony. Everybody knows it. They know it. They've been prepared for it. And they handle the questions really, really gracefully. They should be, because they've been paid to do that. They are the spokespersons, but it is kabuki. There's no truth to it. It's just a show. I think that's what we're talking about.
It is, absolutely. It's
now,
a great example.
If the leader of a company like that came out, and in plain language in the contract, they said, listen, if you do this, you take some risks. And there's some short-term risks and there's some long-term risks. We're actually going to be partners in doing this together. We're going to develop the economic potential, the undeveloped economic potential of what's below the surface of your land. Here are some potential consequences. Here's what we are going to do to try and mitigate those consequences as we do this effort of co-development. But we may make errors. There may be long-term things that we don't know about doing this right now. So I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. Throughout Western Pennsylvania, because they've been mining coal subsurfacely in Pennsylvania, you pretty much don't know when you buy a piece of property whether there's a mine shaft somewhere underneath your property. So the problem of mine subsidence, with mining that goes back like 150 years is legendary. And so somebody, you buy the property, but if nobody's informing you, but you have a genuine experience with somebody, I think the argument we're making in terms of how they're managing their performance, if they engage you realistically with what they know, what the limits are of what they know or know how to do, and you're more likely to basically write them the check for more trust. And if I know some vague idea about how you're going to treat me or how you're going to be if we get into conflict or disagreement about that, I'm willing to even write a bigger check for trust. And that's where it breaks down in most organizations, that the performances are largely unconscious. They're mediated by all the stuff that we talked about, all those domains of diversity and all of that history that each of us have and everybody else that's in the play on stage. And it gets really, really complicated. So my arguments are basically unpack intentionality and put that first, and think about audience and think about who the client is and who you're trying to be and what that client needs from you, because the client doesn't need your true self to show up at every moment in the engagement. The client may need pieces of you at particular points in times and other pieces of you, and you will do it anyway intuitively because it's drawn out of you in the performance space of the client engagement. But if you don't have some sense of trying to master those elements of yourself and master elements of your performance that you're trying to deliver, I think you'll be less effective.
I agree. I don't want to take too much time, although I could keep talking to you probably most of the day. What do you think is next in coaching? What do you think is coming?
More of the same. I'm doing a presentation at the International Congress of Coaching Psychology in February, so I'm working hard on this just in terms of what I think about where it is and where it may be going. So it's come a long way. It's been around for a long period of time. It's gotten more formalized only in the last 30 years. When I got involved in it formally to edit the special issue of the Journal of Consulting Psychology, which at that point was the first issue of a journal that dealt with executive coaching ever. At that point, there was literally one paper and two papers and two dissertations in literature. What year? It was 1996 when the special issue came out. And since then, the literature's just exploded, as people kind of move towards the metaphor and then move towards the practice. I don't see, despite all of the calls for evidence-based coaching, evidence-based practice, that we're going to get there anytime soon. We're almost pre-paradigmatic still. If you wander around here, everybody is selling their particular ideology, and largely their ideology is about the applicability of their ideology to coaching. Emotional intelligence, ACT, CBT. There's a whole list. So what you have is, we've got 115 years, 120 years of the discovery and the invention and the exploration of theories of change largely related to a medical model, a deficit model of restoration of function, of restoring deficits or eliminating deficits in human beings and human behavior. That's why when people use this metaphor of organizational health, it gives me the creeps. Because organizations, by and large, they're not designed to be healthy. That's not their purpose. They're organizations that are designed to deliver healthcare services. But organizations aren't about health. Now, there are aspects of organizational performance that can create the conditions where the organization will not perform. I think the appropriate metaphor goes back to performance. What do we expect from our organizations? We expect them to perform their mission and do that in a responsible and effective fashion. That's what our job is in terms of doing this work.
Very different than being healthy.
Well, and that's correct. But moving into this arena, and when I attend these conferences and I talk to colleagues who are basically steeped in what you can think of as the ideology and delivery of healthcare services, it's all about creating the healthy employee, creating the healthy organization, et cetera, et cetera. Not my job. No, it's not my job. My job is to enable the performance of an executive. And sometimes they have to live in very unhealthy spaces. So part of the job is not to get them out of that. And sometimes I'm coaching people to go even deeper into it because they're called basically to go into those situations and to lead in those situations. So I think we're going to go through a period of time where you are going to have some more experiments. We are going to continue to collect some data. Most of the data, when you look at most of the research studies that are being done, it will not stand up to scrutiny. The measures that are being used are unreliable, they're invalid, there's no replication of the studies that are being done, there aren't valid methodologies that are being used with regard to it, there are only 6 controlled variable, maybe 7 controlled variable studies that are in the literature. Almost everything is saying, okay, it can make a difference to do this. And anecdotally, we continue to get hired. People continue to pay us a premium for doing this kind of work. So at a minimum, I think we're Hawthorning. If we're doing anything and it looks constructive on the surface and it feels good and it looks like people are making change, people are going to continue to pay for that because these are desperate times. I mean, if you're working in an organization around the world, these are not pleasant places. There's very, very few organizations that you're in, even though the organizations are highly functional. And even people who are creative and doing the work and they're performing very effectively, that doesn't mean they're leading healthy lives or they may feel somewhat fulfilled, but they're under really, really significant strain, and that's not going away. You know, I did a presentation about 10 years ago, and I went to the Fortune 500 companies. And I said, how many people are employed by the Fortune 500 companies? So you can go and you can find out. So I added them all up. I came to a rough number. So there was the Fortune 500 around the world, global Fortune 500, employ approximately 125 million people. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's 7 billion of us. Then go and look at the total contribution to global domestic product, global production of these 500 companies. And they're producing a third of the global economy based on 125 million people.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
So what does that mean about the other 6 billion plus people and their net contribution to the global economy? It's a competitive world out there. And so everybody wants to work for these organizations because they are the finest, they are the best, they pay the best, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're going to go there, everybody's not trying to move your cheese, they're trying to eat your cheese. And my metaphor for organizations now is that they aren't really organizations. The larger organizations are actually more equivalent to coral reefs. That these are ecologically, they're our equivalent, if you will. Human culture has produced a new kind of ecology in the world. Literally unleashed it on top of what's taken 3 billion years to build in the world. And we are dealing with, they have been, but will be dealing with the consequences of that ecology, that psychosocial and technological ecology built into and nesting on top of the rest of the biological, the biome, the human biome, not this one, but out there, that the world has built. And we're clueless about it. We have tentative signs, we're doing research about it, but there's no really global sense of what we're doing in the world. And there you have it. You know, if you work for one of these organizations, you're walking around all puffed up. I made it in, and you did. And you're doing better. but you're running, you're sweating hard each and every day with regard to it. And if you're in the same industry as another group of 100,000 people working over there, you're working full time to put me out of business.
And that's your job.
And that's your job. And our jobs is to go in, and this is where healthcare and the health metaphor, to be a healthy company means that they're going to kill and eat you. All right, and people have no idea. They walk into these environments and I'm going to help you be healthy. I'm going to help you be a healthy, what, predator? Yes. And so I think we have to be clear metaphorically about what we're doing and clear-eyed about the nature of the work.
And the landscape within.
Yeah, and the society that we live in. I mean, healthcare, it's kidding itself with regard to what it's all about. It's all about the restoration of function and amelioration of deficits so that we can put them back in to what I call life at the water hole. Quite literally. And so consumers are prey. And the organizations that we work in basically pursue them.
Hey, I come out of a law firm background. The prime metaphor is you eat what you kill.
That's correct.
Which is why I don't practice my profession anymore.
Well, it's...
but that was my choice.
Well, and if you look at, it's interesting you raise it, if you look at the research, and there is a substantial literature on career satisfaction, the law and the practice of law, at least in the United States, probably a third of the people, last time I looked at it, probably a third of the people who get law degrees look back at that and say that wasn't the wisest choice for me.
And it's even higher than that now.
And I'm not surprised by that. I often say there are way too many lawyers in the United States of America. And it is a necessary but totally insufficient way of doing business, and we're way too dependent on, quote, the law and, unquote, lawyers to do humans' business within this.